We're starting very shortly, so please find a seat if you haven't. There's also still a bit of space in the front. Hello everyone to this session. I would like to welcome you to the attacks on Iran and the new phase of imperialism. Our guest here is Tomás Tengely-Evans. He came all the way here from London. And we are very excited for this session. We keep hearing that Western powers are defending democracy and peace. But when you look at what's actually happening, the threats, the sanctions, the airstrikes against Iran, it reveals a very different agenda. And this is what you, Tomás, will be talking about. How Israel's assaults on Iran aren't isolated incidents, but part of a much bigger picture, imperialism. It's the new face of imperialism in the 21st century. This drive for dominance that plays out not just through bombs, but through economic warfare, proxy conflicts, and the control of global resources. By looking at the history of Western intervention in the Middle East, you expose how imperial power operates, hidden behind the slogans of peace and progress. We will hear an input of about max 25 minutes, and then the floor is open for questions, comments. We will maximize that for 2 minutes per person and close with closing remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to speak at this festival. The first thing I want to say is that the ceasefire that Trump pushed through in Gaza doesn't bring in a new era of peace, but rather lays the basis for a new round of war and destruction in the Middle East, not just for the people of Palestine, who are still being murdered by the Israeli occupation forces in Gaza, who are still facing attacks in the West Bank and the whole of historic Palestine, but it also lays the basis for a new round of attacks, particularly against Iran, but other regional rivals of Israel and the United States. If you listen to the speeches by Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu in the Israeli parliament, after that so-called peace deal was pushed through, it was very clear what the agenda was. Trump talked about the Abraham Accords. He mentioned it about 21 times in his speech. What were the Abraham Accords? An attempt to normalize relations, quote unquote, between various Arab regimes, particularly in the Gulf, and Israel. The aim of this was to isolate the Palestinians, but to also cement US hegemony, US control in the region, and to have a region dominated by the US's premier watchdog in the Middle East, Israel. And this is very much what they're hoping to do now. And if you think about Israel's strategy, off the back of 2 years of genocide, 2 years of war, they are now the ascendant power within the Middle East. In the run-up to the genocide taking place, in the run-up to the 7th of October, there were rising rivalries between different powers in the region, which I'll go on to talk about, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and so on. But this system is not a balanced system anymore. Israel is the ascendant power and wants to reshape the Middle East in its own interests and the interests of US imperialism in the coming years. So I want to think about how can we try and explain what the US strategy is, what Israel is doing, but also the broader shifts taking place. Because it's not just the Middle East that's on fire. You have Donald Trump launching trade wars with China and other countries across the world, adding to economic chaos taking place. You have the ongoing proxy war between US imperialism and Russian imperialism within Ukraine. That's causing devastation in that country. And then you have a vast military buildup in Southeast Asia taking place between the United States and China, but also other powers in the region which they're trying to dragoon into rival camps as part of that sort of competition. And Trump seems like a very sort of chaotic and irrational actor. And I think the dominant liberal explanation for what's taking place is that, you know, he's breaking the rules of the game, he doesn't really have a strategy, he's breaking the liberal world order. But actually, I think he is in many ways an unpredictable and irrational character. But on another level, I think he's actually following quite a rational course for US imperialism, which is trying to assert US dominance, although with a different strategy to, say, Joe Biden, Obama, or the presidents that came before him. And I think to understand what's taking place, we need to look at two things. One is, what is imperialism, and what's our understanding of that under modern capitalism? And in a nutshell, I would say that imperialism is a global system of competing capitalist states that's dominated by the major imperialist powers. The United States is obviously the biggest and the greatest threat to peace in the world, but then you have Britain, Germany, France, Russia, and also China emerging as a peer competitor to the United States. And the other thing we need to look at, I would say, are three major shifts within world imperialism and world capitalism, which are driving renewed competition across the world, and also the slaughter that we're seeing within Palestine and the broader region. The first of those shifts is what I would call the return of great power competition. So I think for many decades, we were involved in the anti-war movement, certainly in Britain, but also many other parts of the world. We'd be used to building opposition to the West destroying countries, not exclusively, but largely in the global south. So Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, and so on. And I think that's still a very important feature of what's taking place. But in the last couple of years, what we're seeing is the potential for conflict between imperialist powers themselves. So not simply imperialist powers destroying weaker countries around the world, but actually rival imperialist powers going to war with one another and competing with one another, in a sense much more akin to, say, the situation in the run up to the First World War, when you saw all the major imperialist powers clash in that period of bloodletting. And the main features of this are, one is a decline, or relative decline, of the United States within the world. The ability of the United States to dominate the world and to also demand loyalty from its allies is decreasing. Its economy is declining relative to China, and it remains the biggest military superpower in the world, but it's finding a lot harder to just dictate what takes place in the world. And I think it's facing really a crisis of overstretch and a triple crisis. So they have to deal with what's competition in Southeast Asia, competition in Eurasia and Ukraine, but then also chaos in the Middle East. And really, they're finding it hard to kind of fight on all three fronts, in a similar way to how the British Empire in the run-up to the First World War, back then the dominant empire, was facing overstretch and competition from rising powers such as Germany, France, Russia, and so on. The other characteristic of this is the rise of China as a major power. And I think, if you look at the growth of Chinese state capitalism, Chinese manufacturing, it has reshaped not just Chinese society, but also reshaped the world economy. So the majority now of fossil fuel production and export in the Middle East is orientated towards China. It's had a massive impact on the global economy. The second shift is a breakdown of the liberal capitalist world order. And I'll talk more about this, but essentially the world order the United States built after the Second World War, based on the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, and these sort of multilateral institutions, is now starting to break down. And Trump is looking for more of a go-it-alone approach to asserting US hegemony, US dominance across the world. And this breakdown of that order is actually causing a lot more chaos in the world, a lot more likelihood of war taking place between imperialist powers, but then also competition between the United States and its own allies. Right? So I think that's driving further competition. And the other factor, which I think is particularly important when we're discussing the attacks on Iran and the Middle East are the rise of what we would call regional imperialist powers, particularly within the Middle East. So what do I mean by this? Regional powers that are not like the major imperialist powers, the United States, for example, but they are powers that behave in an imperialist way and try to dominate their own neighbors. And I think we've seen that rise take place, particularly in the Middle East. So Saudi Arabia, Israel, Iran, Turkey, and the UAE are kind of major regional players which try to influence their neighbors, try to dominate the whole region, and try and project their power on a regional basis. And that's another major factor of those three that's driving the kind of changes we've seen. Okay, first of all, kind of what is imperialism, just in a bit more detail, because I think it's, I think we've seen a lot of kind of people brought into politics in the last 2 years out of a revulsion at what's taking place, the kind of way that imperialism has been exposed as this system of blood and filth and genocide, but it's also important to have a kind of political analysis about what is this system that we're fighting, so we're in a better position to fight back against it. And I think there's a kind of common sense view of imperialism, a kind of trans-historical view of imperialism, that it's about stronger states dominating weaker states. And I think that's absolutely true. That's an important feature of what imperialism is about. It's precisely about those unequal relationships within the world system that allows a handful of major powers to extract resources, to extract value, and to dominate other countries in order so that they benefit. However, I think imperialism takes on a particular characteristic, is a particular form under capitalism. So competition between states has existed before capitalism, right? Empires have existed before capitalism, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Greek city-states, and so on, right? However, what happens under capitalism is that geopolitical competition or interstate competition fuses with economic competition in a novel way. And how does this take place? So when, if you think about the sort of early to mid-19th century, when Karl Marx is beginning his investigations of how capitalism works, you're talking about capitalism being restricted to a small part of the world. The market is, has hundreds and hundreds of very small firms competing for what then is largely an unknown world market. However, as capitalism develops, as it grows into a global system, you see what Marx called the concentration and centralization of capital. In other words, firms swallow one another up. You see the creation of oligopolies, of monopolies, of a small handful of what we would today call multinational corporations, which dominate whole sectors of the economy and spill across national borders rather than simply being based within one country alone. And it's these sort of economic changes which actually led to the kind of fusion of economic and geopolitical competition. And I just want to think about how did that happen and what are the similarities today to what's taking place. Just important to say, Marx didn't really write about these kind of changes because they weren't taking place. It was up to kind of later Marxists such as Rosa Luxemburg, Vladimir Lenin, Nikolai Bukharin, and others to kind of develop that sort of analysis of imperialism, because the kind of situation that they confronted was one where basically a handful of European powers at that point, you saw a huge scramble for Africa take place, and within a very short space of time, you see the colonization of basically the whole of Africa taking place. And that's the kind of situation that they're facing. And they're saying, okay, what's driving these changes within the world? Why is it that these imperialist powers are now all of a sudden competing in such a major way for colonial control, for imperialist control within the world in a way that's different to what's taken place before? And not all of their analysis holds today, but I think there's some key bits which are still important. One is they identified that as capitalism grows, you see the internationalization of production, circulation, and exchange. In other words, capital spills across national borders. Corporations spill across national borders in the way that we've seen today. But the second feature that this leads to is a growing interdependence between the state and capital. So, there's a sort of myth under free market neoliberalism that really capitalism is about a small state. Capitalists don't really want the state, they want to cut it. Now, of course, they want to cut social welfare, that's true. They want to cut the health service and all the rest of it. But they actually want quite a powerful state which is able to project the interests of capitalists abroad in competition with other capitalist states. And the state in capitalism is interdependent. So the state requires corporations to be profitable, so it can maintain an army, a police force, and so on. But also, corporations require a state to fight for their interests within this system of cutthroat competition. Now, there were some people who said that this kind of growing internationalization of production would actually lead to fewer wars taking place. We're in Germany, so very famously, German Marxists called Karl Kautsky argued that the growing internationalization of production would lead to fewer wars taking place. The following year, the First World War broke out, so it wasn't a particularly good analysis, one could say. The other kind of more contemporary version is in the 1990s, there was this US neoconservative writer who said that no two countries with a McDonald's would ever go to war against one another because it would be bad for McDonald's. But of course, two countries with McDonald's did go to war with another, Russia and Ukraine, right? So why is it then that despite the kind of international links between capitalists that they see this competition? And I think Lenin identifies an important feature of capitalism, which is uneven development. Capitalism is not a system of equal development across the world, and therefore there's a constant shift in which country is on top, which country is surging ahead in a particular sector, and a constant battle to get to the top of that world food chain, for the major imperialist powers to dominate on a global basis, and for regional imperialist powers to dominate on a regional basis, and to outcompete their rivals. And, think about what's taking place today with AI. AI actually drives a massive interdependence between the state and capital. It's not some sort of, it's all about, horizontal networks, we're all going to be sort of liberated by it and so on, the kind of, popular sort of stuff you hear. Actually, it requires vast concentrations of capital in order to make it work. Vast concentrations of energy, of water and so on, and therefore vast investments by the state to then enable private capital to benefit from this, which then also drives huge competition, an AI arms race, particularly between the United States and China. So you can see how changes in production, the growth and concentration of capital actually drives imperialist competition across the world. So I think those things are still, whilst there's differences between when Lenin, Bukharin and so on are writing, you can still see how the basis of their analysis of this global system of competition and how interstate competition is linked to and subordinated to the accumulation of capital is still incredibly important. The second thing then is about the crisis of US hegemony and the US world order, because I think this is the other background to the kind of attacks that took place on Iran and the way that Israel is trying to reshape the Middle East in quite a fundamental way. So the US builds what I suppose we would call a liberal capitalist world order in the wake of the Second World War in 1945. US imperialism differs, though, in important ways from the kind of European colonial empires that have come before. So the United States doesn't want to have direct colonial control of various parts of the world. It sort of experimented with this in the Philippines and in Cuba, and it proved quite costly. So really what their vision is, a world of free trade and free markets, which multinational US corporations can dominate. And they build this US world order through both military institutions such as NATO. So NATO is a key part of the way that the US projects its power across the world. Hundreds of military bases across the world, but then also institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and the dominance of the dollar. And I think one of the things that you kind of see in that period when the US basically dragoons the other Western states behind its leadership is that within that Western camp you see kind of a partial decoupling of economic and geopolitical competition within the Western camp. So, Germany and Britain and France remain imperialist powers, but they don't compete militarily with the United States in the kind of Cold War period. They compete economically. And that's partly because of the kind of the strength of US capitalism and the way it was able to rally other states behind it. What we're seeing today, though, is a very violent recoupling of economic and military competition on a world scale. In the 1990s, the US emerges as the one superpower left standing after the end of the Cold War, this competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. And on one level, they think that, you know, what we say goes. The older George Bush, after the first Gulf War, said, you know, there's a new world order, and the principle of this world order is what we say goes. The trouble is, life was actually more complicated. There's an old war criminal called Henry Kissinger who died, thankfully, a couple of years ago, right? He said, yes, the US is the one military superpower left standing, but we are going to face economic competition on a scale we have never seen before, particularly from China, as it grows as a power in the world. And therefore, this is a major challenge to the US. And this is really why sections of the US ruling class, particularly around a think tank called the Project for a New American Century, come up with a strategy of trying to overcome relative economic decline through brute military force. Part of that is the expansion of NATO eastwards into Eastern Europe, breaking a promise that they wouldn't expand NATO, which leads to the kind of competition you see between the West and Russia over Ukraine and Central Asia. I don't have time to go into that, although there's a lot to be said about that. The other way that you see that take place is through the war on terror and the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the potential invasion of Iran, which the Bush administration really wanted to go for, but was subsequently held back by. What was that about? Well, you know, sometimes people say that Iraq was a war for oil. That's true, but it's not because the US wanted Iraqi oil for itself. The US has its own oil reserves. It actually got a lot of oil reserves from Venezuela during the kind of 2000s and so on. But it wanted to control this vast resource of oil. So it could say, particularly to China, if you want to see economic growth, it's dependent on our goodwill. You've got to play along with us. You've got to be subordinated to us, and we're still the top imperialist power. Don't try and get ahead of us in the world pecking order. So that's why they wanted to kind of, you know, control, to knock out the Saddam Hussein regime, institute kind of a pliant US puppet regime in Iraq, and then reshape the rest of the region in the interests of US imperialism to bat off this coming competition that they were going to see. There's a problem there, though, in that they were defeated in Iraq. It was, you know, they devastated the country, they murdered over 1 million people. They used sectarian division in order to do this, which laid the basis for the rise of ISIS and the horrors that took place subsequently. But it was a major geopolitical defeat for the United States. They didn't get what they wanted. And rather than sending the signal that, you know, the US is still top dog in the world, Iraq sends the signal that, well, actually, the US isn't all powerful. It's not always going to get what it wants within the world. And that sends a signal to China and Russia that they can kind of start to flex their muscles around their neighbors. But actually, who's the really big winner out of the Iraq war? It was the Iranian regime, right? The Iranian regime that comes to power off the back of the popular revolution in 1979 is severely weakened by the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, devastating war between those two countries, but actually then is able to rebuild to an extent economically and emerges as a more important regional player, and the defeat of the US in Iraq enables it to do this in two ways. One is that devastating sanctions against against Iran mean that it's actually forced to build up its own manufacturing industry, right? And to reorientate its economy onto other parts of the world, right? So actually, Iran has been able to build up a domestic manufacturing industry. The second reason is, in order to kind of push through its occupation in Iraq, the US relied upon sectarian divide and rule. And they tried to build a kind of sectarian Shia state where they gave certain kind of middle-class Shia parties power within Iraq and locked out the Sunni population. This kind of sectarian setup in Iraq means that actually the kind of Shia regime in Iran is able to build relationships with some of those Shia parties within the Iraqi state that had been built up by the West. So when you see the crisis of the rise of ISIS take place, what you see that the United States under Obama is forced to work with Iran militarily against ISIS. So a country that had been part of the axis of evil and had to be invaded was now working in partnership with the US against ISIS. So you can see some of those contradictions there. So Iran emerges actually as partly a winner out of the defeat of the US in the Iraq War, and then also pursues what it calls a kind of ring of fire strategy. So rather than trying to directly confront its main regional rival, Israel, the United States, what it does is to support other sort of national liberation groups, sometimes proxies, across the region. So, it makes a big show of supporting Hamas, the National Liberation Organization in Gaza. It supports Hezbollah in Lebanon, which had defeated Israel in 2006, and it supports the Houthis in Yemen. And the idea is that, it can pressure Israel, but it's not going to come into a direct confrontation itself. That strategy is now unraveling, and I'll say a little bit about that in a sec. The other thing is then, when you think about the world today and what's driving some of those kind of shifts, is the kind of return of great power competition. And I'm not the person actually saying that there's a return of great power competition. It was the United States that first said this. In its National Defense Review in 2018, the US says, look, the main battle for us now is no longer the war on terror, it's great power competition. You read NATO's documents from the 2022 summit in Madrid, they say the main kind of division in the world now is between the United States and China. This is the main competition. Yes, there's this kind of war with Russia going on, but really, this is the main battle taking place. Who will dominate the world economically, militarily? We need to contain the rise of China. So this is the main concern of the first Trump presidency, but also of Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden actually pursues a very similar strategy to the first Trump presidency, both in terms of, being a murdering bastard and all the rest of it, but also in terms of the actual kind of economic strategy. And then Trump actually builds on that legacy of his first presidency and Biden's legacy in many ways. What's the difference, though, I would say, is that Trump feels more constrained by the kind of multilateral institutions. So, he's not going to give up on NATO because NATO is far too useful to the United States. Right? It's very useful to the United States that it basically controls the militaries of Europe through its command chain, right? But he wanted to force European powers, NATO members, to stump up more money and pay for huge rearmament programs off the back of, cutting social welfare, off the back of doing in their own populations. And he wants the kind of freedom to maneuver a bit more on a kind of, not a multilateral basis, alliances of many states, but on kind of more of a one-to-one basis with different countries. And I think that's kind of drives some of his strategy and what he's pursuing. Similarly, like if you look at Ukraine, there's various people who said, Trump wants to do a deal with Putin, that's because he's pro-Russian, he's paid for by the Russians. It's all bollocks, right? That's not why he's doing this. What's the strategy? Because of the sanctions on Russia in that war, the Russian economy and the Chinese economy grew much closer together. And what Trump thinks is, look, we've paid a lot for this war, it's a stalemate now, the main rival is China, let's cut a deal so we can drive a wedge between Russia and China. Right, economically, because we don't want Russia to be permanently in the kind of in the Chinese camp within the world. So that's really, I don't think it's going to work because the negotiations aren't going that well for him. But that's the kind of strategy he was pursuing, a more kind of go it alone approach, but really aimed at maintaining US hegemony in the world. The other thing then is it's not just the kind of amongst the major powers that you see competition increasing. It's also at kind of on a regional kind of basis. I mentioned this. So within the Middle East, I think you've seen the kind of growth of a system of regional imperialist powers grow up. This is predicated upon a much more advanced level of capitalist development taking place within these countries. So, for example, Israel has a massively developed tech sector, and its semiconductor chips are playing an important role in for Western companies, right? So it's not the case that Israel is absolutely militarily dependent on the United States and the West. The genocide could not have taken place without Western arms, without Western funding. But it's no longer economically dependent in the way that it was in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and even 80s upon the West. It's actually a much more advanced capitalist, high-tech economy now. I mentioned Iran having to grow a kind of domestic manufacturing industry, which gives it kind of more leverage. Saudi Arabia, in 2023, it was the first year that more than 50% of GDP came from the non-oil sector. So in other words, Saudi Arabia is no longer just a kind of massive, petrol pump, right? It's actually diversified its economy and developed its economy in quite advanced ways. And therefore, this kind of higher level of capitalist development means that it becomes a more important regional player as well. Turkey and the UAE, you can see similar kind of developments. And it wasn't just over, one of the first kind of test grounds of this is Syria, where, Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, and the UAE all intervene in the Syrian civil war, which is launched by the Assad regime to put down the popular revolution, to help destroy the country because they're trying to compete for regional dominance and gaining control, jockeying for position in Syria was important. So you can see that more advanced capitalist development in the region means that these powers can actually, strive for regional hegemony, regional leadership in a much bigger way. Just a couple of things. What's our kind of attitude? What should our kind of attitude to this be? On the one hand, I think, first of all, I'm not equivocal in a war between a major imperialist power and one of these regional imperialist powers. So, for example, if there was the United States and Israel attacked Iran, I am for the defeat of the United States and Israel. I have no illusions in the Iranian regime. I want people in Iran to rise up against it, support the women life freedom movement, and all the rest of it. But if there's a war launched by the United States and Israel against Iran, I'm for the defeat of the United States and Israel, right? So there's not an equivocation on this sort of basis. The second thing, though, is that I think it's important we don't have illusions that these regimes are in some way going to bring liberation towards the Middle East. Rather, it's the people within these countries rising up against imperialism, but also against their own rulers, which provides the path towards genuine liberation within the region. Just lastly, because I'm probably going to run out. I don't know. I'm probably going to run out of time. I'm banging on here. I think the attacks on Iran show some of the tensions between the United States and Israel in that relationship. What are those tensions, and how did they kind of lead to the attacks, but also the ceasefire? So, Israel is the watchdog state of the United States in the Middle East. This is a role that was cemented, particularly after the 1967 Six-Day War, where really Israel proves its worth for US imperialism in the region. We'll be your watchdog, give us the money, we'll put down the Arab nationalist regimes, we'll be the police man in the region, right? And that's still very much true. But what the kind of more advanced capitalist development in Israel does, what its growth as a kind of regional imperialist power in its own right does, means that it can strain at the leash more. It's a watchdog, but it can kind of try and strain at the US leash more and try and force, the US into positions which aren't necessarily in the kind of the longer term, strategic interests of the United States. So think about the genocide. Of course, the United States was never serious about doing anything to stop the genocide, but there were points when it was worried that the scale and brazen nature of it would actually destabilize the broader region. So, for example, if Israel pushed the population of Gaza into Egypt, that could actually destabilize the Egyptian dictatorship and could lead to people rising up. That wouldn't be in the interests of US imperialism, because those regimes, such as the El-Sisi dictatorship, for example, are part of the US imperialist infrastructure. So there were various points when the US said, can you just kind of, be a bit more nice about this genocide, please. We're not going to do anything, but could you please not be so open in how you're murdering people? And the Israelis said, fuck off. They said, okay, if you want us to kind of maybe tone it down a bit, we'll actually spread war. And what they did, they spread war to Lebanon, they spread war to Yemen, they spread war to Iran, and threatened a much broader regional conflict. And the strategy of Israel was to say, we'll escalate, and the escalation will lock in US support. Because when push comes to shove, the United States will always support Israel, because it's the watchdog state. So Netanyahu had this strategy of really widening the war, spreading the war, in order to lock in Western support for what for the genocide and the way that he wanted to reshape the region. There are still, and I think you see that with the attacks on Iran, because you see the initial attacks by Israel, and the US says, well, we knew about them, but we weren't involved in the planning of them, which basically means we weren't that happy about them, because they were worried that actually it would lead to a broader conflict. And also, Trump at one point was hoping to cut a deal with Iran over its nuclear facilities. Why? Because actually Iran is getting much closer to China. So 90% of Iranian oil is bought by China, right? So Trump was thinking, do I really want them to push them closer towards China? Probably not. The idea of a US-Iranian deal is horrifying to Israel, and that's, I think, part of the reason why they launched those attacks, because they wanted to bust up the possibility of a deal taking place. And then push comes to shove, what does the US do? It bombs Iran in a highly performative way, and then you see that kind of highly performative kind of retaliation take place as well. So I think you can see the tensions between the US and Israel that there are, and that what kind of the strategy of Israel has been. I'll finish in one sec. You can see the limits of that strategy, though, because I think the attack on Qatar, on the Hamas headquarters, was a massive question of overreach by Israel, because the US, the US needs Israel. It's a watchdog state in the region. However, it wants to build alliances with the Gulf states in the region. The Gulf states are incredibly important to kind of the region. The growth of Gulf capitalism has been an incredibly important development, and Trump really wants to do deals with these states. An attack on Qatar is not a good, therefore kind of fucks that strategy up for the United States. So therefore I think Qatar, that attack really is a tipping point then when Trump says, okay, we've backed you, but now we need to try and wind this conflict down, and comes out with that, really atrocious so-called peace plan, which is a colonial land grab and all the rest of it, but really puts pressure on Netanyahu to say, look, we'll back you to reshape the region, but we've got to stop these broader attacks taking place on these other states, because we want to do deals with them as well. So I think when you look at the kind of horrors we're seeing, it's very much linked to a world of growing inter-imperialist competition, which is rooted in the system, and therefore, I'll talk more about it later, maybe in the summing up, is to take that on. That means supporting those, supporting people who are resisting imperialism in the region, looking towards the agency of workers and the poor in the region, but then also, if we're in the West, thinking about how we can utilize the power of the streets, but also the power of workers in the way that we saw in Italy, to disrupt the arms supply chain, to disrupt the war machine, and strike at the kind of the profit system, which is intimately linked to the kind of imperialist horrors that we're seeing.
Thank you, Tomás, for your insightful analysis, member and editor of Socialist Workers' Party in the UK. We're taking questions and comments now. Please raise your hand, and there's a person who will pass on the mic.
Hi, it's an Iranian woman, Iranian-born woman and activist speaking here. First, I want to acknowledge the activation that I feel right now in my body, listening to this talk, just so that it can settle. A first point that is not specifically about Iran, but that I want to mention about many of the talks that I heard here today, is that in all the talks we're only speaking about the Middle East when we refer to the region, and I think in this context we know that there are other terminologies that are not colonial terminologies, and I would appreciate if at least sometimes we could use Swana, Western Asia, or depending on the context, actually refer to the right terminologies. I also really want to express that I would have appreciated the representation of a local body and voice on this stage when it's the only session referring to the land of Iran. I think, and what I feel in my body is that it would have been very helpful to the time that we spent here to go deeper. And so I would like to share some things that I feel are relevant when we speak about Iran, because this felt like, what I can say is there is a lot I can feel when I think of Iran and our whole region. And I didn't sense any feeling, any compassion, and I didn't hear about the people other than a side remark at the end. When I think of Iran right now, I think of the depletion that many people are feeling in the continuation, in the aftermath of women life freedom and all that was invested, all the death that we had in this country amongst youth especially. Yeah, and the disappointment there is for where we are in this moment. I want to speak that we are experiencing the highest numbers of executions, especially of ethnic minorities, in decades, and that this is something that we were saying from the first day that the bombings started this time, that the aftermath will be that a lot of people will suffer, and here we are. Highest numbers in executions, about 1 million people from Afghanistan that were forcefully and brutally deported into the hands of the Taliban as the aftermath of this. I am thinking about the cities of Iran where over 50% of the women are walking without hijab. And of course, it carries the taste of classicism still, because it's happening more amongst privileged people of Iran. But still, the frame of our cities have changed and is something that is never being acknowledged. I want to speak about the fact that we're sitting in a country of Germany that is still today the biggest European trade partner of the Iranian regime. I'm going to talk about Siemens, that is providing a lot of the technology that this regime uses. I want to acknowledge that Germany was the biggest supporter in providing the chemical weapons of that war that you referred to and that I was born to, for example. I think when we're having these conversations, as much as we love the intellectual stimulation, especially amongst white bodies that feel very tend to this conflict because there is more power, actually, I really would appreciate if we could bring a bit of perspective and humility to the conversation.
Thank you. I'd like to give some chance for others to speak as well, so that's why we will keep it to 2 minutes. Thank you for your contribution. The person in the front here with the grey pullover.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. Very, very informative. I just wanted to wonder if you could talk a little bit about the military-industrial complex and if this is like a means to open a new economy for US imperialism or like whatever imperial powers to try and dominate the economic market again.
Thank you so much. I'm also from Iran, and I would also like to give a little bit of perspective on the situation of the working class in Iran. I think I don't have any disagreements per se with what you said about the global situation, but I think there's some things that are missing from what is the situation of the Iranian working class people. You know, we had the Jinjian Azadi movement, which was the kind of strongest opposition movement that we have had in Iran for 40 years, only 3 years ago. And it was, of course, brutally crushed, but actually the regime, we became aware that the regime is the weakest that it has ever been in 40 years. And that really the people in Iran, they came to the streets from different layers of society and they really resisted this horrific, really a manslaughtering regime in Iran. And yeah, so, and I agree, of course, with what you said about the number of executions that right now are, you know, the regime is kind of, yeah, implementing. And I wanted to say, what is the perspective, or I wanted to ask you, what do you think the perspective is for the Iranian working class, given the situation that we have had this year, the war? I think, of course, we in Germany, we will oppose any weapons deliveries to Israel for many reasons. Of course, what you said about that in a situation where there is a war between the US and Israel against you know, a non-imperialist country, which I don't think Iran is an imperialist country, even though there is regional hegemony. I would say the way that you classified imperialism, this is my understanding as a Marxist. I would not say that Iran is an imperialist. You cannot compare Iran to the US or to Germany. But still, it posed a difficult situation for the Iranian working class. I spoke to many people in Iran, including my family. Of course, they were not happy that there were bombs falling on their heads, and they hate what Israel is doing to, you know, to the Palestinians. But at the same time, they hate their regime and they want to get rid of it. It has really oppressed our people for 40 years. And what is the perspective in this situation for the Iranian working class who are, you know, forced in this situation of war? My uncle was forced to still work on the streets of Tehran because he had no money to go somewhere else. He could not afford it, so he was working while there were bombs falling on his head. So yeah, this would be an important question because I think it poses a dilemma. And I also wanted to say something about Hezbollah, Houthis and Hamas, because, I'm sorry, I will come to an end, because the people in Iran, the slogans oftentimes was, don't give our money to Hezbollah and Hamas. And while, you know, I'm of course for Hamas winning against Israel, this is clear, and I do believe it is important to, you know, support the resistance in whatever form against imperialism. I still have a problem in a way with this because, of course, these forces have also oppressed many times the left. So yeah, what is, how can we bring these things together, because imperialism has really succeeded in separating and dividing our region and our people against each other. Thank you.
Thank you. More questions, comments? Yes, the lady in orange.
Thanks first for the input. Just one thing about China, and I feel like the articulation that you said Iran is having kind of like the free choice to choose to go for Chinese, basically oil. How you said that basically China is the only country that is buying the oil from Iran. I don't think so. I mean, there are definitely ideological reasons behind it. Iran, China, blah, blah. But I think we need to also acknowledge the fact that sanctions doesn't really let Iran to have another options. European countries, they could buy the oil from Iran, but they didn't because they don't dare to like have a conflict over American sanctions on Iran. So I don't really like this link that it was a free choice. It's actual consequences of political sanctions. That first thing I wanted to address. And second thing, 45 years, like I call it Cold War between Iran and Israel. After the next day of the revolution in Iran, Israel was the biggest enemy and vice versa. And for Israel, it just takes 2 days to completely destroy the whole country. So for me, it's a bit naive interpretation to say US and Israel had disagreement over this war. And then suddenly, after 12 days, Trump says, oh yeah, ceasefire. And Israel is like, yeah, cool. And then this doesn't really make sense. And I think it's quite like much complicated than that, and I don't buy it that it was disagreement between US and Israel. About the facts that my friends also mentioned, it's also very good to say Iran vs. Islamic Republic, especially after 3 years of the biggest feminist revolution. That's it, thank you.
Thank you. Was another hand, a few, yes, you, in the black. Thank you.
Sorry, I hope I be articulate enough. I'm also Iranian and an activist that I was in Iran during the Jina Revolution. So what I wanted to say was that at that time, as a socialist, I felt a kind of weird relationship with the global left, in the sense that I could see some sort of colonial relationship, as if like our reality or our revolution was not being representing it. It won't be in the favor of the political interest of the global left. And of course, it was kind of like, to describe how I felt, I could remember this memory of Leila Khaled, who was in prison in Egypt at the time, and there was this delegation of the USSR coming to the Egypt, and he could describe that as I was in the prison, I could hear the International being played in Egypt, and there was this kind of like two-folded emotion that I had. So what I wanted to say is that when I reflect back, I found myself in a unique position that I could really criticize the global left, and what I saw and what I found the most problem with was the part in the global left that worked mainly with the theory of imperialism. And what I had like problems with that was that, I mean, I didn't have any specific problems with today's talk because like there was some mention or recognition of the revolution in Iran, but still when I think about the imperialism theory, it's as if like we say that there was resistance in Iran, but it has no central part in our analysis. Because in the theory of imperialism, sometimes we mistake like socialist theory or revolutionary theory with geopolitics. But geopolitics is not socialist theory in the sense that, like, at least that's what I gathered, that like states are not actors. It's not that US wants this, US wants that, and the world is not an empty space on which the imperialist power acts on. There are like resistance, and there are like, yeah, sorry for that, I try to keep it short. And like what it does is that like, because it's really important entangled also with imperialist powers, because like since the revolutions in all the Arab countries or in Iran and the war that, and the role that plays is that they don't let revolution happen. You know, they make it like mundane, like everything. They want to bring up like regional killers because they can make long-term, for instance, promises. Like this is the kind of problem that I try to convey that I find with the imperialist theory. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for all your contributions and questions. I'm going to have to close the discussion round now due to time constraints. I will give 5 minutes for you for your closing remarks, Tomás.
Yeah, thanks for the contributions. 2 points. One is, when people like Lenin and Luxemburg and Bukharin developed the Marxist theory of imperialism, it wasn't an academic exercise. Understanding the how capital accumulation, how competition between states drives war, they did that because they wanted to understand how they could end the war and build a successful socialist revolution. That's why Lenin goes off to analyze imperialism. So I think understanding the shifts within the global system, the return of great power competition between the US, China, Russia and other states, the big shifts that are taking place between Israel, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey and the UAE and so on, that's to help us better understand what's taking place so we can seek to change the situation. So I don't think there's a kind of separation between a theory of imperialism and giving people agency. I think within a kind of proper Marxist theory of imperialism, it's precisely about trying to give people, trying to reassert the fact that working class people have agency, because the whole point of understanding imperialism and building opposition to it is to turn the war between capitalists into a war against the capitalists in every country. And that was kind of the aim of developing that. So one of the things about the growth of kind of more advanced capitalist development within say, Iran, within Saudi Arabia, or within other countries within the region, what does this also do? It creates a much more bigger and potentially powerful working class that actually has agency over what takes place within the region. So therefore, the growth of capitalism, a much more higher level of development of capitalism, actually creates the potential for powerful forms of resistance against US domination, against Israel, but also against all the regimes in the region which are ruled by a minority at the top, like all capitalist societies are. I think turning that into reality is difficult, and I'm not going to sort of bullshit and say it's about to happen or it can happen easily. So to take two examples. One is Egypt, and I think, when was Israel at its most isolated within the region? It was during the Arab Spring and during the wave of revolution that took place there. Why haven't we seen a return of that kind of revolt in Egypt? I think that's partly because of the legacy of counter-revolution, the way that society became so militarized and so much more oppressive than it was even before the revolution under the El-Sisi dictatorship. However, there is no kind of safety valve anymore in Egyptian society. There's no kind of, they've hollowed out the Muslim Brotherhood, any semblance of the state trade unions, and so on. So therefore, if it does break out, it could actually be incredibly explosive within the region. And, a resistance to that regime and Palestine solidarity and opposition to imperialism runs together, and you see that throughout history. I think, the revolt that took place in Iran was incredibly important, and I agree that I think there were vast parts of the left which basically think the way you oppose Western imperialism is by supporting other states which say they're against Western imperialism. I'm against that kind of approach. So yes, in a war between the US, if the US and Israel attacked Iran, I'd be for the defeat of the US and Israel. That doesn't mean I think that the Iranian regime is a principled anti-imperialist force that should be defended, any more than the regime of Assad was in any way an anti-imperialist force. I think, the vast parts of the left get that wrong, and that's because of the legacy of Stalinism and the way that that continues to shape the left. I disagree with that. I think the left should have been much more vocal in supporting the Women, Life, Freedom revolt that was taking place. It's true, absolutely, that one of the reasons that the Iranian regime didn't feel confident enough to launch a kind of more thoroughgoing attack on Israel was because it feels so weak in the wake of that revolt. And actually, I think that shows counter to the kind of argument that we just have to support the regime. Actually, the regime's repression and the way that it repressed that revolt actually weakens anti-imperialist resistance within the region. So you have to support the agency of ordinary people against that regime if you actually want to strengthen the fight against imperialism, rather than saying this is an anti-imperialist state, we should just get behind it. So absolutely, I think that's an important part of it. But I think when it comes to, there were some small initiatives that took place which are important. So I remember reporting there was a statement by, by a number of small independent unions in Iran which said we are against what Israel is doing and we're against our own government. It was the Tehran Bus Company and a number of other small unions that launched that statement. Now that's very small compared to the mass of the potential Iranian working class, but it's those kind of initiatives which are actually where hope lies, where people articulate the demands on the ground saying we are against the regime, but actually we're also against US imperialism, we're against all the regional powers that want to jockey for position, and we're for articulating our own demands and taking our future into our own hands. Because that's how I think you really challenge imperialism. The First World War was the first inter-imperialist conflict in the world. How did it end? It ended in revolution, when people took matters into their own hands. And that really, that is how you have to try and have a vision of challenging it. The last thing I'll say is I don't think Iran had a choice when it came to saying we're going to sell oil to China. They were forced to do that because of the sanctions. My point is that the reason China's doing that isn't because it cares about the people of Iran. It's because it wants more influence in the region and wants to kind of jockey for position. And therefore, we have to be against all these powers jockeying for position, whether they're major imperialist powers or regional powers within the region who are trying to do that. And I think the way to do that is to reassert the agency of people in the region, but then also say we in the West can also do something, which is to try and target our own war machine, arms spending, and the arms supply chain, which can then hopefully help people in the region fight back as well.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming, for listening, for contributing. I hope that the discussion goes on elsewhere, off stage, and see you for the next one. Thank you. Bye.